At just 16, Malik Turner stood in court trying to defend his actions quietly, respectfully. But Judge Judith Halberd shut him down without a second thought. To her, he was just another defiant black kid wasting the court's time. But what she didn't know was that Malik had spent his life studying law taught by his father, a civil rights attorney, whose legacy they tried to erase. And when Malik finally spoke, he didn't just defend himself. He challenged everything she thought she knew. What happens when a black boy knows the law better than the judge herself? If that question grabs you, hit like, leave a comment. And let's step inside the courtroom where truth doesn't come from power, but from courage. The courtroom doors opened with a sharp creak, and just for a second, every conversation died mid-sentence. All eyes turned as a teenage boy stepped in alone. No lawyer, no parent, no hand on his back to guide him forward. Just a worn-out hoodie, a pair of sneakers 2 sizes too big, and a backpack gripped tightly in one hand. He walked slowly like someone who knew he didn't belong there but had no choice but to show up anyway. His name was Malik Turner, 16, charged with obstruction of justice and unlawful protest after refusing to leave school grounds during a demonstration. But what the court saw that morning wasn't a protester. They saw a black boy standing by himself in a place where even grown men hesitate to speak, and that silence, it wrapped around him like a sentence already passed. Case number 372C. State of Georgia versus Malik Turner, the clerk announced. Malik stepped forward. His voice, though soft, carried clear. Present. The judge barely looked up. Seated high on the bench was Judge Judith Halberd, 60 years old, white, sharp-eyed, and sharper-tongued. She had ruled over this county's juvenile court for more than 2 decades. To her, Malik was another smart-mouthed teen who thought marching around with a poster made him untouchable. She removed her glasses, sighed, and said flatly, "Mr. Turner, where is your attorney?" Malik met her gaze, his voice steady. "I don't have one, Your Honor." "That's not an answer," she snapped. "Why don't you—" "I asked for a public defender. No one contacted me." Judge Halberd narrowed her eyes. "You're telling me you received no assistance? Not even a phone call?" "No, ma'am," Malik replied. From the prosecutor's table, Paul Dalton stood up, buttoned suit, polished shoes, and a voice that filled the room even before he spoke. "Your Honor." Dalton began given the defendant's refusal to cooperate with school officials and his disruptive actions on campus. It's clear this isn't about misunderstanding. It's defiance. He staged an illegal protest, ignored repeated warnings, and endangered the learning environment. "We're requesting immediate proceedings. No delays." Malik's eyes flicked toward Dalton, but remained calm. Halberd raised her brow. And what exactly was he protesting? Dalton didn't hesitate. "A mural, Your Honor." The school removed a wall painting of the defendant's late father, an attorney who, by all records, had no official school recognition. The protest was not authorized. He occupied the hallway with signs, led chants, and according to witnesses, refused to leave until police were called. The courtroom shifted. A quiet murmur spread from the back benches. Judge Halberd turned to Malik. "Is that accurate?" Malik nodded slowly. "Yes, I was protesting." "And why," she asked, "did you believe that was acceptable behavior?" Malik paused. His fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. "Because it wasn't just a mural. It was a piece of who he was, and who we are." They erased it without asking anyone. No notice. Just gone. Halberd leaned forward. "So you decided to take justice into your own hands?" "No, ma'am. I just wanted someone to explain why he didn't matter." The judge exhaled, clearly unimpressed. "This isn't a philosophy class, Mr. Turner. This is a courtroom. We deal in facts, not feelings." Dalton smirked. "Exactly. Your Honor. And the fact is, his actions created chaos. Other students followed him. Teachers were blocked. It became a scene. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I didn't touch anyone." Malik interjected. "I just stood there, like I'm standing here now." The judge's gavel hit the block sharply. "You will not interrupt this court again," she warned. Malik stood still, but his voice didn't waver. "I'm not trying to disrespect you, ma'am. I'm trying to be heard." Another murmur, this one quieter. A teacher in the back shifted, visibly uncomfortable. A local reporter scribbled faster. Halberd's face hardened. "We can continue today or reschedule for counsel to be appointed. But if you insist on speaking for yourself, Mr. Turner, you will follow procedure. You will not grandstand. You will not turn this into a protest. Malik nodded once. I understand. But there was something in his voice that didn't sound like surrender. It sounded like patience. Like someone who had been waiting to speak his truth not just for weeks, but for years. The courtroom didn't know it yet. But they weren't watching a boy trying to escape judgment. They were watching someone preparing to confront it with more than just words. With knowledge. With memory. With fire that didn't shout, but simmered. And in that silence, as he stepped back and took his seat, Judge Halberd wrote something on her notes. But if you looked closely, her hand had started to tremble just a little. It didn't take long for Paul Dalton to take the floor again. He stood with a confidence that filled the space between the judge's bench and the defense table like a man used to being listened to, especially in rooms like this with defendants like Malik. He didn't look at the boy when he spoke. He looked straight ahead at Judge Halberd, as if the outcome was already written, and he was just reading the parts aloud. Your Honor, he began. Let's not be distracted by how quiet the defendant appears in this courtroom. The actions that led him here were anything but passive. According to statements gathered from school staff and security footage, Mr. Turner organized a student protest that disrupted the normal operation of Jefferson High. He posted online in the days leading up to it, encouraged others to join him, and when asked repeatedly by the school principal to disperse, he refused. Judge Halberd didn't respond. Not with words, but her face, tight, unreadable, seemed to nod without moving. Dalton continued flipping a page in his binder with a deliberate gesture. We also have evidence that Mr. Turner remained in the building after hours without authorization, likely to post signs and prepare materials for the protest. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was planned, deliberate. And while the subject of the protest, a mural, is certainly emotional for the defendant, we must remind ourselves that emotions do not excuse unlawful behavior. We recommend the court proceed with formal charges and consider sentencing recommendations that reflect the need for accountability and deterrence. Still not a single glance toward Malik. The boy might as well have been invisible. Judge Halberd folded her hands. She leaned forward slightly, her tone dry. So, a hallway protest over a mural becomes a case of obstruction, and now the court's expected to treat it as something more than a disruption. Dalton nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. She looked down at the file, her lips moving silently as she skimmed. Then she raised her head and shifted her attention finally to Malik. Young man, she said, do you understand what's happening here? Malik straightened in his chair. Yes, ma'am. You understand that this courtroom is not a classroom, and you are not here to give speeches. I do. You're not here to defend your father's honor. You're here to answer for your actions. Whatever you think this is, it's not a history lesson. It's the law. A pause hung between them, thick and stifling. Then Malik's voice, low but clear, said, May I speak, Your Honor? That question, so simple, seemed to irritate her more than if he'd shouted. She removed her glasses, set them down slowly, and narrowed her eyes at him. This court, she said, does not need lessons from a teenager. And just like that, it landed. Not like a hammer, but like a whisper that turned into a slap. The courtroom didn't gasp, didn't react outwardly, but something changed. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their chairs, in the way a reporter in the second row stopped writing mid-sentence. Malik didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just nodded once and sat down. But his eyes stayed on her. They didn't blink. They didn't harden. They simply watched. Not with defiance, but with a quiet patience that said, I heard you. I see you. I won't forget this. That silence that followed was louder than any speech he could have given. Because the moment wasn't about shouting back. It was about being denied the most basic thing, his voice. Even Dalton, for all his confidence, glanced sideways at the boy now seated in stillness. And for a second, just a flicker, something about Malik's composure unsettled him. But not enough to stop. May I remind the court, Dalton added, that the school had no choice but to involve law enforcement. The defendant resisted requests to leave, and when confronted, he refused to comply. We're not punishing an opinion, we're enforcing order. Judge Halberd nodded slightly. And what were the words painted on the mural? Dalton looked down, then read, Justice begins with truth. The words hung there like a challenge. The judge sighed, then leaned back. Let the record reflect. The court acknowledges the symbolic nature of the protest, but reiterates that no citizen, minor or adult, is exempt from the law, simply because they believe their cause is righteous. She tapped her pen once on the bench, then looked to Malik again. You'll remain in the courtroom while we proceed with witness testimonies. You will not interrupt. Is that understood? Yes, Your Honor. And that was it. The hearing rolled forward without him around him, above him, like he was a stone dropped into a river and the current just kept flowing, pretending it hadn't been disrupted. But in that corner of the room, Malik sat, not angry, not broken, just still, like someone who had seen this all before, long before he was old enough to enter a courtroom, like someone who had already learned that in certain places, truth had to wait its turn. And today he would wait, but not forever. It didn't take long for Paul Dalton to take the floor again. He stood with a confidence that filled the space between the judge's bench and the defense table, like a man used to being listened to, especially in rooms like this with defendants like Malik. He didn't look at the boy when he spoke. He looked straight ahead at Judge Halberd, as if the outcome was already written, and he was just reading the parts aloud. Your Honor, he began. Let's not be distracted by how quiet the defendant appears in this courtroom. The actions that led him here were anything but passive. According to statements gathered from school staff and security footage, Mr. Turner organized a student protest that disrupted the normal operation of Jefferson High. He posted online in the days leading up to it, encouraged others to join him, and when asked repeatedly by the school principal to disperse, he refused. Judge Halberd didn't respond, not with words, but her face, tight, unreadable, seemed to nod without moving. Dalton continued flipping a page in his binder with a deliberate gesture. We also have evidence that Mr. Turner remained in the building after hours without authorization, likely to post signs and prepare materials for the protest. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was planned, deliberate. And while the subject of the protest, a mural, is certainly emotional for the defendant, we must remind ourselves that emotions do not excuse unlawful behavior. We recommend the court proceed with formal charges and consider sentencing recommendations that reflect the need for accountability and deterrence. Still not a single glance toward Malik. The boy might as well have been invisible. Judge Halberd folded her hands. She leaned forward slightly, her tone dry. So, a hallway protest over a mural becomes a case of obstruction. And now the court's expected to treat it as something more than a disruption. Dalton nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. She looked down at the file, her lips moving silently as she skimmed. Then she raised her head and shifted her attention finally to Malik. Young man, she said, do you understand what's happening here? Malik straightened in his chair. Yes, ma'am. You understand that this courtroom is not a classroom, and you are not here to give speeches. I do. You're not here to defend your father's honor. You're here to answer for your actions. Whatever you think this is, it's not a history lesson, it's the law. A pause hung between them, thick and stifling. Then Malik, voice low but clear, said, May I speak, Your Honor? That question, so simple, seemed to irritate her more than if he'd shouted. She removed her glasses, set them down slowly, and narrowed her eyes at him. This court, she said, does not need lessons from a teenager. And just like that, it landed. Not like a hammer, but like a whisper that turned into a slap. The courtroom didn't gasp, didn't react outwardly, but something changed. You could feel it in the way people shifted in their chairs, in the way a reporter in the second row stopped writing mid-sentence. Malik didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just nodded once and sat down. But his eyes stayed on her. They didn't blink. They didn't harden. They simply watched, not with defiance, but with a quiet patience that said, I heard you. I see you. I won't forget this. That silence that followed was louder than any speech he could have given. Because the moment wasn't about shouting back. It was about being denied the most basic thing, his voice. Even Dalton, for all his confidence, glanced sideways at the boy now seated in stillness. And for a second, just a flicker, something about Malik's composure unsettled him, but not enough to stop. May I remind the court? Dalton added that the school had no choice but to involve law enforcement. The defendant resisted requests to leave, and when confronted, he refused to comply. We're not punishing an opinion, we're enforcing order. Judge Halberd nodded slightly. And what were the words painted on the mural? Dalton looked down, then read, Justice begins with truth. The words hung there like a challenge. The judge sighed, then leaned back. Let the record reflect the court acknowledges the symbolic nature of the protest, but reiterates that no citizen minor or adult is exempt from the law simply because they believe their cause is righteous. She tapped her pen once on the bench, then looked to Malik again. "You'll remain in the courtroom while we proceed with witness testimonies. You will not interrupt, is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor." And that was it. The hearing rolled forward without him, around him, above him, like he was a stone dropped into a river, and the current just kept flowing, pretending it hadn't been disrupted. But in that corner of the room, Malik sat, not angry, not broken, just still, like someone who had seen this all before, long before he was old enough to enter a courtroom, like someone who had already learned that in certain places, truth had to wait its turn, and today he would wait, but not forever. He hadn't meant to remember that night. It just came rushing back, the smell of old paper, the sound of pages turning, and his father's voice low and steady, cutting through the silence of their tiny apartment, like it always did when the world outside was too loud to bear. Malik was 10 the first time he sat across from his father at the kitchen table, while legal briefs lay scattered between plates of leftover stew. Most kids his age read comics. Malik read depositions. His dad, Marcus Turner, didn't teach law the way school taught history. He taught it like it was survival. Every line of a statute was a brick in the armor you needed to walk through life without flinching. Every case precedent was a story about power, who held it, who abused it, and who got crushed under its weight. That last night, Malik remembered the air was still. Rain tapped softly against the window like someone trying to whisper a warning. His father looked tired, more tired than usual, the kind of tired that sank into your bones. Malik had asked, "Why do you keep fighting cases if they never listen?" Marcus had smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling like they always did when he wasn't sure how much truth a child should hear. "Because sometimes, son, the point isn't to win right away. It's to plant something, so that someday someone else has a place to stand." He leaned closer, tapped one finger on Malik's forehead. "And don't ever forget, don't fight with fists when you can outthink the system. That's where they never expect us." Now, sitting in the courtroom years later, Malik could almost feel that tap again. The world had stripped the man from the mural. The school painted over it like it was a mistake, like his father's voice never echoed through those halls, like he hadn't stood there in that exact pose. One hand raised, pointing to the word justice, chalked on a blackboard, the other gently holding the shoulder of a small black student who looked so much like Malik, it made people stop when they passed. The mural had been more than paint. It was memory, proof, and now it was gone. And so was his father, killed in a car crash no one investigated too closely. A crash that came just weeks after he filed a civil rights complaint against the county police department. A coincidence, they said. Nothing suspicious. Let it go. Malik never did. Even as a boy, he sat with those dusty case files long after his mother stopped asking him to go to bed. He read trial transcripts like bedtime stories. He taught himself how to spot loopholes, how to read emotion in cross-examinations, how to question a question before answering it. Every night he tried to see what his father saw, how truth could live between words if you knew where to look. He didn't carry a textbook into court, but the law was already written in him. He sat now still and quiet, watching the system twist words around him like vines. But he didn't flinch, because he knew what was coming. They thought he was just a kid sitting in the wrong seat, but that's what his father had prepared him for seats. They told you didn't belong in. Conversations they assumed you were too young, too black, too angry, too soft-spoken to survive. The judge's voice cut back in, but it sounded far away like a bad radio station fuzzing out at the edge of a signal. Malik didn't respond. Not right away. He blinked, breathed, and remembered. "You don't have to raise your voice," his father had said. "You just have to raise your presence. And make sure when you speak, even your silence has meaning." He didn't flinch when the prosecutor leaned forward with his next stack of accusations. He didn't move when the judge glanced his way like he was a problem she hoped would solve itself. He just waited like his father had waited through every courtroom that pretended not to see him. Waited like the truth always did, quiet, patient, and sharper than anyone expected. Because when Malik finally spoke again, he wouldn't be speaking as a boy defending himself. He'd be speaking as the voice of the man they tried to erase. Malik stood again. His voice wasn't loud this time. It wasn't smooth either. There was a slight tremble, just enough for anyone listening closely to catch the weight of fear he was swallowing. "Your Honor," he said. Eyes locked onto Judge Halberd. "Just 60 seconds, that's all I ask. Please, let me explain." The judge didn't even blink. She leaned back in her chair, one brow arched as if she were being forced to listen to a broken record for the third time. "This is a court of law, Mr. Turner," she replied flatly. "Not a soapbox for juvenile speeches. You've already disrupted one institution. You won't do it again here." Malik stood still for a beat, lips parted. The words were there, caught in his throat like a stone he couldn't quite swallow. But he didn't plead again. He just sat back down slowly, carefully, like someone folding their pain into silence. Paul Dalton leaned in toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, voice oily smooth, "I believe this boy's stunt has taken up enough of the court's time. I move that we proceed to summary judgment." Halberd nodded. Motion granted. Begin closing remarks. It was swift, clean. Just like that, they tried to close the book on him. In the back row, a woman scoffed. Another voice whispered just loud enough for Malik to hear. "Kid thought he'd come in here and drop some grand speech like the movies." Someone else chuckled. Cute. It was the kind of laughter that didn't need volume to cut deep. The kind that told you your words would never be enough, even before you'd said them. Malik didn't look back, he didn't respond. But for the first time, he looked tired. Not weak. Tired of being ignored, dismissed, judged before he even opened his mouth. The judge turned slightly in her chair. "Let's move this along." Dalton cleared his throat, reaching for his notes. Malik blinked slowly. Then, with no announcement, no drama, he leaned forward and unzipped his backpack. It was the soft zip in a dead-silent room that turned heads. He didn't flinch, didn't rush, just reached in and pulled out a thick plastic sleeve, sealed carefully, every paper inside aligned perfectly like it had been prepared for months. He placed it on the table in front of him. No words, just a sound thud as the file landed. Dalton paused mid-sentence, his words trailing off. "What is that?" the prosecutor asked, narrowing his eyes. Malik didn't answer. He simply met Dalton's stare with a stillness that was louder than shouting. Judge Halberd frowned. "Mr. Turner, what is in that folder?" Malik finally spoke softly, but with iron under each word. "Documentation, witness statements, constitutional references, school board meeting minutes, all of it, related to my case." Dalton let out a scoff. "Prepared by whom?" "You this is irrelevant. He's a minor, Your Honor. This is performative." Malik turned to him, calm and controlled. "My age doesn't disqualify facts. You told this court I acted irrationally. That folder proves I didn't." Halberd didn't respond. Her eyes flicked between Malik and the folder. For a second, just a second, her fingers twitched like they wanted to reach for it, but she folded her hands instead. "Unless submitted through counsel, it's not admissible." "I understand," Malik said, "but it still exists. And once this hearing ends, it'll exist in the public record one way or another." The room grew quiet again, dead quiet. No one laughed this time. The boy had stopped asking for permission, and that silence stretched taut across the courtroom like a wire ready to snap said everything. He wasn't just waiting anymore. He was daring them to keep ignoring him, and in that moment it became clear this wasn't over. Not even close, Your Honor. "May I speak one last time?" Malik's voice didn't shout, but it cut through the courtroom like a blade through silk. Crisp, calm, undeniably firm. Judge Halberd narrowed her eyes, already half lifting her gavel. "Mr. Turner, this court." "I understand," he interrupted, not loudly, but with quiet control. "You've made your position clear. But with all due respect, I haven't yet had the chance to make mine." That sentence lingered. For the first time, it wasn't just words coming from a teenager. It was an assertion of presence, and everyone in the room felt it. Dalton let out a short, dismissive breath. "The boy wants to recite the Constitution now," he muttered, half to himself, half to the judge. Malik didn't flinch. "I don't need the whole Constitution," he said, turning slightly toward Dalton. "Just a few lines of law you seem to have forgotten." There was a shift in the room, barely visible but real. The boy who had sat so still was now holding the floor. "I was 10 when my father gave me a book of landmark Supreme Court cases," Malik began. "I didn't understand them all, but there was one I never forgot, Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. Halberd leaned back, folding her arms. "In that case," Malik continued, "students wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War. They were suspended. But the court ruled that students do not, quote, shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate." He paused, just long enough to let it land. I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I made a mural, and when it was destroyed, I sat in silence. My protest, just like theirs, was peaceful, but I was charged. Halberd's gavel lowered an inch, but she didn't speak. Dalton stepped forward, voice rising. This isn't a legal debate club. He's twisting precedent. Malik looked at him, steady, not defiant, just resolute. I'm quoting directly, sir. Would you prefer I move on to West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, 1943? The judge stiffened. In that ruling, Malik went on. The court decided students couldn't be forced to salute the flag or recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Why? Because the First Amendment protects not just what you say, but your right to say nothing at all. It said, and I quote, "No official can prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of opinion." Now the room was still. Not the performative silence from earlier, this was a kind of stillness charged with recognition. Halberd's fingers twitched. Dalton's brow furrowed deeper. Malik's voice dropped to a lower register, measured, deliberate. Your Honor, you told me this courtroom isn't a classroom. But if law can't be learned here, how do you expect it to be respected anywhere? That line cracked something. It didn't make noise, but it broke through. Dalton's lips parted as if ready to object, but nothing came out. Halberd stared at the boy, her mouth slightly open like the breath had been pulled from her lungs by the weight of what she wasn't ready to admit. Mr. Turner, she finally said, the gavel now trembling in her grip. You are not a licensed attorney. I never claimed to be, Malik replied, not missing a beat. But neither were Tinker or Barnett. They didn't need a degree to know their rights. They just needed the courage to say them out loud. There was no applause, no shouting, but in the back of the courtroom someone exhaled, and in the front row the court stenographer had stopped typing for a moment, just staring stunned. Halberd didn't blink. Dalton leaned into the bench again. Are we seriously entertaining this as legal argument? Halberd didn't answer him. Instead, she looked at Malik, really looked at him for the first time that morning. And for a flicker of a moment, something changed in her expression. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't approval. It was recognition that the boy standing before her wasn't trying to win. He was trying to be heard. Malik slowly sat down, smoothing the file folder on the table like it was sacred ground. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't smile. He just waited. And as the silence stretched across the courtroom once again, it no longer felt like weakness. It felt like control, not because the system gave it to him, but because for the first time he'd taken it back with nothing more than the law that was supposed to protect him all along. Lena Bryant hadn't planned on staying long that day. She'd covered dozens of hearings like this before, routine, predictable, painfully uninspired. Another young defendant, another overworked court docket. She took a seat in the back row of courtroom 3B, opened her notepad, and let her eyes glaze over as the gavel struck. But then she heard the name, Malik Turner. The pen slipped from her hand. It wasn't just a name, it was a memory. Mr. Turner? Jacob Turner. Her old social studies teacher. The one who had stayed after class to help her catch up when she nearly flunked junior year. The one who looked her in the eye the day the school board tried to expel her for plagiarizing and said, everyone gets a second chance, but not everyone gets someone who believes they deserve it. She had never forgotten him. And now, his son was standing alone defending himself in a courtroom full of people who barely saw him as human. Lena leaned forward. Her breath caught in her throat. Malik's face was sharper than his father's, more angular, more guarded. But the calm in his eyes, the way he listened before he spoke, the way he carried silence like a language of its own, that was Jacob Turner through and through. She watched as the boy quoted Tinker as he challenged the prosecutor with the clarity of someone who didn't just read the law, he understood why it mattered. When Malik said, if law can't be learned here, how do you expect it to be respected anywhere? Something inside her cracked. Lena wiped at her eyes before anyone noticed. And then she stood up, walked quietly out of the courtroom, and headed straight to her car. She didn't need to think. She just needed to write. That night, long after most reporters had filed their routine blurbs, Lena sat at her kitchen table typing into the glow of her laptop screen. No edits, no polish, just truth. She titled it The Courtroom Where a Boy Taught Justice. She didn't open with legal jargon or headlines. She opened with a memory. He once taught me that justice isn't loud. It's patient. It listens. And sometimes it waits in the back of a courtroom until someone brave enough dares to remind us why we need it. She wrote about Malik, about the mural, about his father, about how this wasn't a case, it was a reckoning. She described Judge Halberd's face the moment she realized the boy wasn't trying to win sympathy, he was holding up a mirror, and about how Dalton, the prosecutor who once demanded silence, had no words left when law itself was used as a shield by the very child he tried to shame. When she finished, Lena sat back in her chair staring at the final paragraph. "We keep asking how to fix the system. But today I saw it in a boy who never raised his voice, never raised his hand, only raised the standard." She hit publish. By morning, the story had over 400,000 shares. By noon, it was over 1 million. Screenshots flooded Twitter. Celebrities reposted excerpts. Civil rights attorneys called Malik a once-in-a-generation voice. Former students of Jacob Turner left comments filled with gratitude, pain, and pride. And in the heart of it all was that line, "A boy who taught justice." The public didn't just read it, they felt it. And the tide turned. Local news stations who had once ignored the case started scrambling to catch up. Commentators demanded to know why Dalton had pursued charges so aggressively. Legal analysts began dissecting Malik's arguments on national TV. And suddenly the courtroom that once felt like a cage now felt like a stage that the system could no longer hide behind. Outside the courthouse, people began gathering, not in protest, but in silent support. Some held signs with quotes from Malik's speech. Others just stood there, arms crossed, eyes locked on the front doors, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside her office, Lena received a short, anonymous message on her desk. Just 3 words. He saw it. No name, no sender. But she didn't need one. She knew exactly who it came from. And somehow she knew he was proud too. Judge Judith Halberd slammed her chamber door shut, the sound echoing too loud in the silence. Her heels clicked across the marble floor as she moved toward the case files laid out neatly on her desk, except one. One had been pulled from archives. She hadn't opened it in years. The label read, "Jacob Turner vs. City Board of Education." She hesitated, then pulled it open. There he was. Jacob Turner. Malik's father. A man whose name she had forgotten, yet whose words had just unraveled her courtroom like a quiet explosion. Inside the file were transcripts, motions, handwritten annotations, his annotations meticulous and burning with purpose. She read, "If they shut you out, make them hear you. If they don't see you, make them look. But never scream. Speak so precisely that they can't argue with the truth." Judith blinked. Her throat felt tight. It was the same calm fire she had seen in Malik's eyes. Then she heard her own voice echo from the courtroom hours earlier. "This court doesn't need lessons from a teenager." What a thing to say. No, what a thing to mean. She dropped into her chair, exhausted. But it wasn't physical. It was something deeper, older. The weight of decades. Of moments passed off as protocol when they were really power moves. Of order in the court, meaning silence from the poor. The room dimmed as twilight bled in. She whispered almost to herself, "What if I've been punishing the wrong people my whole life?" A knock interrupted. It was her clerk. "Judge." The articles trending online. The journalist Lena Bryant, she was in court. She called it the courtroom, where a boy taught justice. The door closed again. Judith's hands trembled as she pulled up the article on her laptop. And there it was, Malik's name, his face, his voice, captured in Lena's words like a beam of light through years of shadow. And at the bottom, over 20,000 shares, hundreds of comments. One stuck out. He made them listen without ever raising his voice. That's power. She leaned back, remembering something she had buried. When she was 16, her father, a stern lawyer from South Carolina, had taken her to her first courtroom. A black man had been dragged in for loitering near a school. He had spoken politely, asked to explain. The judge shut him down in under 3 minutes. Her father said, "See that? That's efficiency." Now, decades later, she heard it differently. Not efficiency, erasure. She reached back to the file, flipping to the last page. There was a photo Jacob Turner standing before a classroom, chalk in hand. The board behind him read, "Don't fight with fists. Outthink the system." Those were Malik's words, not just quoted, inherited. Judith Halberd stood slowly, walked to the mirror, and for the first time in years, she looked past her robe, past the authority. She saw what she had refused to see for decades. A woman who had spent her career enforcing the law, but never questioning whose law she had been enforcing. She whispered, "What if I've been silencing truth all these years?" Her voice cracked on the last word. She sat back down, grabbed her legal pad, began scribbling sentences, questions, fragments. When does discipline become dismissal? When a student teaches justice, is the system still just? How many voices have I overruled that were actually right? The lines came like water from a broken pipe, and then she stopped. She stared at the top of the page and wrote clearly, "The People versus Malik Turner reconsideration." Tomorrow she would return, but not as the same judge, not as the same woman, and certainly not with the same silence. She would walk back into that courtroom and listen, not because she was forced to, but because for the first time in her life, she chose to. And if the system didn't like it, well, they could learn, just like she did. The courtroom buzzed, not with noise, but with the thick tension of expectation. People leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. And they were right. When Judge Halberd re-entered the courtroom, the bailiff didn't call for silence. He didn't have to. The silence had already arrived. She looked different now. Her shoulders no longer squared in icy authority, her step a little heavier, as if she were carrying more than her robe. The same woman who had once dismissed Malik Turner with a glance now paused, looked down at him, and said something no one expected. "This court," she began, "will allow a final word from the defendant, Mr. Turner." The entire room blinked. Paul Dalton stood abruptly. "Your Honor, may I remind the court, this case is in its closing phase. This is highly irregular." "Sit down," Mr. Dalton Halberd snapped. "I said the boy will speak." Malik didn't flinch, but his fingers twitched at his sides. He stood slowly, shoulders straight. His voice, when it came, was low, but each syllable landed like a stone on glass. "I was never trying to cause trouble," Malik said. "I was trying to preserve a memory, a mural of my father, a man who gave his life to the law, not to break it, not to exploit it, but to teach it to believe in it." He looked out across the room. Many of the same people who had scoffed at him hours ago now held their breath. They painted over his face without warning, like his work didn't matter, like we didn't matter. He took a shaky breath but continued. "When I stood up at school and refused to let them erase his name, I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I simply stayed. I stayed still, stayed silent until they dragged me away." Murmurs rippled across the room. Dalton was shifting uncomfortably. "And now I'm here, charged for disruption." Malik turned to Judge Halberd. "But wasn't it Dr. King who said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere? If a student standing up for history is a crime, then maybe we need to take another look at who the real threat is." Dalton jumped up again, his voice louder now. "Objection, he's giving a political speech." Judge Halberd didn't look at him. She looked only at Malik. "Go on," she said quietly. Malik reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He didn't need it. He knew every word by heart. "I've studied law since I was 10, not in classrooms, at our kitchen table. My dad made me read cases like Tinker v. Des Moines, where the court ruled that students do not shed their rights at the schoolhouse gate, and West Virginia v. Barnett, which said no authority can force us to salute what we don't believe in." He raised his eyes to meet hers again. "So when you said this courtroom isn't a classroom, I wanted to ask if we're not allowed to learn about justice here. Then how do you expect us to respect it out there?" You could hear someone inhale sharply. No one dared exhale. Paul Dalton looked frozen. Even Halberd didn't speak. For the first time all day, she simply sat still. Then she stood. Her gavel remained untouched. She looked around the room, then returned her gaze to Malik. "I've spent decades wearing this robe," she said slowly. "And too often I've confused silence with order. Today, a young man reminded me that silence isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's the sound of something being buried." She turned to the clerk. "This charge is dismissed. All records will be sealed. Mr. Turner is free to go." Gasps. Someone in the back clapped before stopping, unsure if it was allowed. But then another, and another. A slow wave of applause rose, not raucous, not celebratory, just respectful. Earned. Halberd raised one hand, silencing the room again. "But I need to say this," she added. "This courtroom does not silence wisdom. Not anymore. Thank you, Mr. Turner, for reminding us what law is supposed to be." Malik didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just breathed, his chest rising for the first time without weight. As he stepped down, a woman near the aisle whispered, "That boy just changed everything." And in many ways he had, because for once the gavel didn't end the hearing. A voice did, and it came from a 16-year-old black boy who had stood alone and taught a room full of adults what justice truly meant. The hallway outside the courtroom felt like a different world now. Where there had once been stares, whispers, and tension thick enough to cut through, there was now only a deep ringing silence, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Malik stood still near the doors, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the courtroom's echo of applause still lingering somewhere behind him. He had just walked out, but the weight of what had happened hadn't yet fully caught up to him. His heart was racing, but his face stayed calm until he heard a voice he hadn't heard in over 4 years. Malik. The voice was old, rough around the edges, but unmistakably familiar. Malik turned slowly. There stood a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s. His skin, a few shades darker than Malik's, had aged with the kind of wear that spoke of silent battles and quiet regrets. He wore a plain navy coat and held his hat nervously in his hands. It was Elijah Turner, Malik's uncle, his father's younger brother. The man who had vanished after the funeral, after the threats, after the mural had been painted, then painted over. They hadn't spoken since. I wasn't sure I should come, Elijah said, clearing his throat. Didn't think I had the right. Malik didn't answer with words. He dropped his bag to the floor and stepped forward. And then he hugged him. It wasn't hesitant or polite. It wasn't the kind of stiff embrace people give out of obligation. It was the kind of hug that said, "I missed you. I needed this. You still matter to me, even after everything." Elijah held on tight, one hand trembling on Malik's back. "I was a coward," he whispered. "Your daddy." He raised his voice when it mattered. "I stayed quiet. I told myself it was to protect you, but the truth is I was scared." Malik pulled back, eyes glassy but focused. "You're here now." That was enough. A few steps away, Lena stood silently watching the reunion unfold. She hadn't expected to cry again today, but there it was, the sting in her throat, the tears rising like a tide. She still had the printed article folded under her arm, now smudged at the corners from being clutched too tightly. She had seen the full circle. She remembered the man in the mural, the lessons he taught. She had been just one of dozens of students he'd mentored and saved. And now his son stood here, his voice, his clarity, his fire. A young boy had walked into that courtroom carrying the shadow of a father's dream and somehow turned it into light. She took one last photo, not for the paper, not for the story, but for herself. A reminder that justice doesn't always come from verdicts. Sometimes it comes in moments like this, in an embrace, in forgiveness. In a boy who remembered who he was, even when the whole system tried to make him forget. Malik looked around the hallway at Lena, at his uncle, at the faces now smiling or nodding as they passed. And for the first time since stepping into court that morning, he let the tears fall. Not out of fear, not out of pain, but because someone finally saw him. The morning after the verdict didn't begin with applause or headlines. It began the same way it had for years, with Malik riding his bike through the quiet streets before sunrise, the cold wind stinging his face, his backpack swaying behind him. But when he turned onto the avenue where the school stood, something had changed. The mural was back, not just restored but transformed. Where there had once been a single image of his father teaching justice to a circle of black students, now there stood a new panel added alongside it. This one showed Malik himself standing in the courtroom holding a copy of the Constitution. In his left hand, his right lifted, not in anger, not in defiance, but in clarity. The brushstrokes captured his eyes with uncanny precision. Calm. Knowing. As if the painter had been there that day and heard the silence after his words. It didn't feel like a tribute. It felt like a promise. Inside the courthouse, Judge Halberd submitted her formal resignation. The paperwork was brief, but the note she left behind said more than a dozen rulings ever could. "I've spent decades demanding respect for the law. Now I want to spend what time I have left helping people understand it." She had accepted an offer to teach legal ethics at a small community college, where no one would stand when she walked in. She wanted to earn her audience now. She said so herself in a quiet press conference, the only one she ever gave. "I no longer wish to preside over silence," she told the cameras, especially when it costs someone their voice. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office launched an internal inquiry into Paul Dalton's previous cases. Several showed signs of excessive charges, coerced statements, and bias against students of color. Dalton was suspended indefinitely. He declined all interview requests, citing unfounded public pressure. But the pressure wasn't unfounded. It was earned. And it didn't come from rage, it came from truth. As for Lena Bryant, her article, "The Courtroom Where a Boy Taught Justice," had reached over 3 million readers. She was offered national platforms interviews, even book deals. She turned them all down. Instead, she visited Malik's school and read the article aloud in the same auditorium where the mural had once been covered with tarpaulin. The students listened in stillness, some blinking back tears, others clenching their fists, not from anger but from awakening. And Malik, he didn't speak to the press. He didn't take a victory lap. He didn't try to go viral. But he did accept an invitation from the National Human Rights Initiative, a scholarship program for young legal advocates. They offered him mentors, travel, resources. But most of all, they gave him time. Still, every morning before classes, before meetings, before anything else, Malik rode his bike past the mural. Not out of pride, not to check if it was still there, but because that wall had once taught him who his father was. Now it reminded him of who he had become. No one clapped when he passed. No one followed him with cameras. But sometimes the janitor would nod from across the field. Sometimes a teacher would stop and simply say thank you. And on one morning, as a young girl with braids and bright eyes stared up at the mural, she turned to Malik and asked, "Is that really you?" He smiled, parked his bike, and sat beside her. "It was me then," he said gently. "But the law, it belongs to you now too." They sat there in silence, the kind of silence that didn't erase people, the kind that made space for what was coming next. Because justice didn't come roaring in. It walked in on the quiet footsteps of a teenager who refused to sit down when told to be small, and the wall stayed. This time not because it was protected by policy, but because it was guarded by memory. If this story moved, you take a moment to reflect on what it really means. Malik's journey wasn't just about winning a case, it was about reclaiming a voice that the system tried to silence. It was about a boy who stood alone, and in doing so reminded an entire courtroom and all of us that justice isn't loud, but it is lasting. At Mr. Mack's Stories, we believe in telling stories that matter, stories that shine a light on truth, dignity, and quiet courage. If you felt something while listening, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mack's Stories for more powerful stories just like this one. Your support means the world to us. It fuels our passion and helps us keep uncovering voices the world needs to hear. And remember, sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the biggest truth. Let's get into the next story.